If you're aiming for a top LSAT score, you cannot afford to get basic logical reasoning concepts wrong. And one of the most common high-impact blind spots is the confusion between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions. Now that logical reasoning makes up 2/3 of the LSAT, mistakes in this section hurt more than ever. Every question you miss here is going to hurt you disproportionately. So mastering the distinction between these two types isn't just helpful, it's essential. Now, let me be clear, the LSAT is not testing obscure trivia. It's testing whether you can spot the structure of arguments. And these two question types are built on two completely different definitions of what it means to assume something. A necessary assumption is something the argument depends on. It has to be true or the whole thing falls apart. In contrast, a sufficient assumption is something that, if added, guarantees the conclusion. It might go way beyond the original argument, but if it locks everything into place, it works. Now, most students treat both as things the author believes, and they move on. But that thinking leads to wrong answers. And worse, it leads to predictable wrong answers the LSAT writers know will tempt you. Now, why is this distinction so tricky? It's because the names sound similar. Because both appear under the assumption umbrella in prep books. And because when you're under time pressure, you're not thinking about definitions, you're thinking, which of these sounds good? And that's how the LSAT gets you. What makes this even more urgent is that necessary assumption questions are extremely common. You might see 3 to 5 of them in a single logical reasoning section. Meanwhile, sufficient assumption questions, much less common. So if you're unclear on the difference, you're not just making occasional mistakes, you're bleeding points consistently in one of the most frequent question types on the entire test. And here's the part most students miss. Even if you're strong in logical reasoning overall, maybe you're already in the 160s, this distinction can be the difference between a good score and a great one. So if you want to finish the test feeling confident, rather than second-guessing every assumption question, if you want to spend your time eliminating trap answers instead of getting tangled in them, then you need to learn to recognize these two types instantly, just by glancing at the question stem. Because once you do that, the strategy becomes automatic. You'll know what kind of answer you're looking for before you even read the stimulus. And that is how high scorers move faster, stay calmer, and rack up more points. This is not optional. This is foundational. Now, here's the thing no one tells you. Most LSAT students, even the ones scoring in the 160s, routinely mess this up. They think that necessary assumption and sufficient assumption are different flavors of the same thing, like chocolate versus vanilla. But that's not what's happening here. These two question types are built on completely different logical relationships. And yet, here's what students and even some test prep companies do. They throw both into a mental junk drawer labeled assumption questions. That's like mixing up addition and division just because they're both math. It's sloppy thinking. And sloppy thinking leads to wrong answers, period. And here's what that looks like in real time. You read the stimulus, you see the word assume in the question stem, and you immediately start looking for a gap in the argument and ask, what would make this stronger? Sounds harmless, right? But it's not. That is the sufficient assumption mindset. But what if you're actually dealing with a necessary assumption question? Now, you're not just using the wrong strategy, you're actively falling into the LSAT's trap. Because here's what the test writers love to do. They stick a tempting sufficient assumption answer choice right into a necessary assumption question. It looks like it strengthens the argument, it feels airtight, but it's dead wrong. Why? Because it isn't required by the argument. And that's what necessary assumption is all about. Requirement, not completion. This single mix-up leads to false confidence, wasted time debating choices, and your LSAT score being a 160 instead of a 170. What's worse is that this mistake is entirely avoidable. The LSAT is not unpredictable. It's not a magic trick. It's a pattern recognition test. If you train yourself to ID the question type correctly before you dive into solving it, you're already halfway there. The question stem tells you everything you need. If you see the words requires, depends on, or assumes, you're dealing with necessary assumption. On the other hand, if you see allows the conclusion to be properly drawn or enables the conclusion to follow logically, you're dealing with sufficient assumption. You don't need to guess. You don't need to feel it out here. You just need to read the question stem carefully and literally. If you mislabel the type, even if you have perfect logic skills, you're still going to fall into the trap. That's what makes this mistake so dangerous. It's not about intelligence. It's about applying the wrong rulebook to the right game. If you fix this, everything in logical reasoning gets easier. Now let's cut through the jargon and get to what these terms actually mean. Because once you understand the difference between necessary and sufficient assumptions in plain English, everything else starts to click. First, necessary assumption. Think of it as the bare minimum support beam in an argument. It's not flashy, it doesn't have to prove the conclusion, but if you take it away, the whole thing collapses. Here's the test. If this assumption turned out to be false, would the argument fall apart? If the answer is yes, congratulations, that assumption is necessary. Necessary assumptions are not about making the argument stronger. They're about keeping it standing. You don't always notice them because they tend to be subtle, quiet, and unspoken. But they're always there in the background, holding everything up. Now, let's talk about sufficient assumption. This is the magic key that unlocks the conclusion. It doesn't have to be realistic. It doesn't have to be likely. It just has to make the argument work completely and without doubt. Here's the test. If this assumption were 100% true, would the conclusion definitely follow? If the answer is yes, you've got a sufficient assumption. Sufficient assumptions are bold. They might introduce new ideas. They might go beyond what the argument originally said. And that's okay, because their job is to guarantee the conclusion. One is required, the other is powerful. Let's use a real-world example. Let's suppose you had an argument saying, I'm going to get wet because I forgot my umbrella. One is required, the other is powerful. Necessary must be true for the argument to work. Sufficient makes the argument airtight if it's true. They serve different roles, and if you mix them up, even just a little, you'll chase the wrong answer again and again. But if you get this part right, if you truly understand the core definitions, then everything else becomes easier. You'll stop second-guessing yourself. You'll know exactly what to look for, and you'll start choosing answers with confidence, not hope. Now here's the shortcut high scorers use. They don't try to feel out what kind of assumption question it is. They don't guess. They read the question stem carefully and literally, because the LSAT doesn't hide what it's asking. It tells you right there in the stem if it wants a necessary assumption or a sufficient assumption. Now here's why this matters. If you misread the stem, even by just a word, you'll start solving with the wrong approach. That's like trying to open a combination lock with a car key. It doesn't matter how well you turn it, it's not going to work. And the LSAT knows this. That's why they put tempting wrong answers from the opposite question type right in your path. You pick the answer that makes the argument stronger, and boom, you fall for the trap. But once you train yourself to scan for those keywords, you stop falling for those traps. You move faster, you stay calm, and you gain a massive edge over everyone else who's still guessing. Now let's talk strategy. Not theory, not wishful thinking, actual data-driven prep strategy. Because when you look at the LSAT from a bird's eye view, something becomes crystal clear. Not all question types are created equal. Some show up constantly, and some barely make an appearance. And when it comes to assumption questions, here's what the numbers tell us. Necessary assumption questions appear way more often than sufficient assumption questions. You might see 3 to 5 necessary assumption questions in a single logical reasoning section. Sufficient assumption, maybe 1 or 2. So what does this mean for you? If you're confused about the difference between the two, and if you're still mixing them up, then you should put the bulk of your practice time into mastering necessary assumption. That's where the points are. So let's say you had an hour to drill assumption questions. Do you spend 30 minutes on necessary and 30 on sufficient because you want balance? Or do you spend 45 minutes on necessary and 15 on sufficient? If you're optimizing for return on time, the second option is the no-brainer because it better matches the actual weight of these questions on the exam. And here's something else students don't think enough about. Because sufficient assumption questions are so rare, they don't appear often enough to justify memorizing a dozen different diagramming strategies until you have mastered necessary. It's just not worth the mental overhead unless you're already scoring in the high 170s and trying to grab every possible point. But necessary assumption, that's worth mastering because it's not just its own category. It also shows up embedded in other question types like flaw, strengthen, and weaken. So when you master necessary assumption, you're not just gaining points in that one category. You're upgrading your logical toolkit across the board. Think of it like this. Sufficient assumption is a sniper rifle, rare, precise, useful in very specific moments. But necessary assumption is a Swiss Army knife. It shows up everywhere, and you're going to need it all the time. So structure your study plan accordingly. Don't chase the shiny objects. Double down on what actually moves your score. Now let's say you've ID'd the question type correctly, but now you're staring at 5 dense answer choices. Some sound smart, some sound extreme, some feel right, but you're not totally sure. Here's how high scorers cut through the noise. They use language as a filter. Because the wording of the answer choices isn't random. It's part of the trap, or the clue. If you know what to look for, the right answer practically waves a flag. For necessary assumption questions, you want to gravitate towards moderate, reasonable, cautious language. So look for phrases like some, at least one, may, tends to, is likely, and not all. These answers should feel a little boring. They don't make bold claims, but that's the point. Because necessary assumptions are all about what must be true, not what's exciting. So avoid extremes. Answers that say all, only, must, or never are less likely to be right. Why? Because extreme language makes the assumption less likely to be required. If there's any way the conclusion could still work without that extreme claim, it's not necessary. So ask yourself, if this were false, would the argument fall apart? If the answer is yes, even for a boring little claim, it's probably your answer. Now for sufficient assumption questions, the right answer could be as extreme or bold as it wants, as long as it guarantees the conclusion. It doesn't have to sound realistic. It doesn't have to sound like something the author would say. It just has to make the logic airtight. That means you'll often see answers that introduce new ideas, combine 2 or more existing ideas in a clever way, and make bold leaps that sound like overkill. And that's totally fine. Remember, you're not looking for what the argument needs, you're looking for what makes the conclusion follow 100%. Now, a common trap here is that students will eliminate these bold answers because they sound too strong or like they go too far. But that is exactly what a sufficient assumption often looks like. Don't let the intensity of the choice scare you off. Instead, ask yourself, if this were true, does the conclusion definitely follow? If yes, it's a contender, no matter how dramatic it sounds. Bottom line, for necessary assumption, you want moderate language because it has to fit inside the argument. For sufficient assumption, any language that locks in the conclusion, even if it sounds intense, could be okay. Once you build this language filter into your thought process, you'll spot wrong answers faster, trust your instincts more, and stop wasting time debating between 2 similar sounding choices. This is one of the most practical ways to cut your time per question without rushing or guessing. Let's get real about diagramming. Some LSAT prep companies make it sound like you've got to diagram everything. They'll say, if there's a conditional statement, draw it out. But here's the truth. On necessary and sufficient assumption questions, diagramming is usually a waste of time. Let's break it down by type. For necessary assumption questions, do not diagram. Seriously, don't do it. Necessary assumption questions are about informal logic. That means everyday reasoning, common sense assumptions, and hidden gaps that make the argument work. They're not loaded with conditionals. They're not built like math equations. So instead, focus on understanding the core claim the author is making, finding the gap between the evidence and the conclusion, and using the negation test to check if a choice is required. Again, almost no necessary assumption question will benefit from drawing out anything. In fact, it usually makes things worse because it adds complexity to questions that were meant to be solved with clarity, instinct, and common sense reasoning. For sufficient assumption questions, diagramming can sometimes help, but only in specific cases. If the stimulus includes multiple conditional statements, big if-then chains, and terms like only if, unless, or whenever, then sure, you could break out the arrows and diagram it. And when you do, you want to look for that missing link that connects the evidence to the conclusion. What you're often doing here is trying to build a bridge between what you're told and what the author concludes. That bridge is usually a missing conditional statement, the sufficient assumption that, if plugged in, makes the conclusion logically follow. But let's be clear, even with sufficient assumption questions, only a handful per test are actually built this way. Most can be solved just by understanding the argument structure and eliminating bad answers. So don't make this your default. Don't think, oh, it's a sufficient assumption, I've got to diagram. Instead, think to yourself, are there clear conditionals in the stimulus that would make my diagramming useful? If yes, go for it. If not, skip the diagram. You'll save time, energy, and mental clarity. Now let's make this real. No abstract logic, no conditional chains. Let's talk about something everyone understands: money. Imagine you want to buy something that costs exactly $1. What would be sufficient to buy it? Well, for example, having $1 million would be sufficient. Is that necessary? Definitely not. But is it enough? Yes. If you have $1 million, you can absolutely buy something that costs $1. That is the definition of a sufficient assumption. It gets the job done even if it's more than what's needed. Another sufficient option? Having exactly $1. That still gets the job done. It is still sufficient. So think of sufficient assumptions as the more than enough or just enough tools that complete the job, even if they go above and beyond what's actually required. Now let's flip it. What is necessary to buy the $1 item? You would need at least some amount of money, let's say a penny or a nickel or a dime or a quarter. None of these are enough to buy the item, but they are all necessary parts of reaching $1. So think of it like this. If you don't even have a penny, there is no way you can make up the full dollar. So the penny doesn't complete the purchase, but it's part of what is required to make it happen. That's how necessary assumptions work. They're pieces that must be true, but might not be sufficient to prove the conclusion on their own. So how does this all apply to the LSAT? If a question asks for a sufficient assumption, you're looking for the $1 million answer, the one that is enough or more than enough to guarantee the conclusion. If you're looking for a necessary assumption, you're looking for the penny, the piece without which the conclusion couldn't even start to work. And yes, sometimes the answer will be both necessary and sufficient, like having exactly $1. But on the LSAT, those overlaps are rare. Most right answers are one or the other, not both. Now let's talk about one of the LSAT's favorite tricks, the kind of trap that trips up even the most well-prepared test takers. You've probably experienced this. You're working through a question and you find a choice that feels perfect. It connects the dots. It strengthens the argument. It makes everything feel right. You're thinking, this must be it. But here's the twist. That perfect answer is from the wrong question type. It is a sufficient assumption answer choice planted inside a necessary assumption question. And if you fall for it, you're done. You will confidently pick the wrong answer and move on without even realizing it. Because most students don't actually know the difference between necessary and sufficient. They lump both question types into one mental bucket and ask themselves the same generic question: which answer makes the argument stronger? And that's where they lose, because makes stronger is not the standard for either question type. Remember, for necessary assumptions, it must be true or the argument collapses. A sufficient assumption guarantees the conclusion if added, and so when you treat both types the same, you're vulnerable. You're not solving the right problem, and the test knows it. So let's say you're working on a necessary assumption question. Here's what they do. In answer choice C, they put a tempting sufficient assumption, something big, bold, and powerful. It feels like it connects the argument, but it's not required. The real necessary assumption is hiding in choice D. It's quieter, it's less flashy, but if you take it away, the argument breaks. And so if you haven't trained yourself to recognize the question type and filter answer choices accordingly, you're gonna pick C and feel good about it until you see that red X on your practice test. So to protect yourself against these traps, you wanna lock in the question type before you read the answer choices. If it says requires, depends upon, or assumes, you are in necessary assumption territory. Do not start thinking in terms of what would make this stronger. That is a different game. You also want to be suspicious of bold claims in necessary assumption questions. Strong language isn't always going to be wrong, but it's a big red flag. You want to ask yourself, if this weren't true, could the argument still stand? If yes, eliminate it. It's not necessary. And you want to practice recognizing those tricks of misdirection. Go back to the questions you got wrong and ask yourself, was this choice tempting because it sounded powerful or because it was truly required? That reflection will teach you faster than any textbook could. So bottom line, the LSAT is not just testing your logic. It's testing your discipline, your ability to pause, ID the question type, and apply the correct standard even when another answer looks more appealing. Fall for the trap and you lose points without even realizing it. But if you spot the traps, you start gaining points where others stumble. And that's what separates a 165 from a 175. Now, if you've ever stared at 5 answer choices in a necessary assumption question and thought to yourself, these all kind of make sense, but I don't feel great about any of them, you're not alone. Necessary assumption questions can feel slippery. The right answer often sounds vague or underwhelming, and you're left second-guessing yourself. And that's where the negation test becomes your secret weapon. This is a simple technique with one goal: to test whether a choice is truly necessary for the argument to work. Now here's how you use it. You take the choice, you flip it by turning it into its logical opposite, and you ask, if the flipped version were true, would the argument fall apart? If the answer is yes, if the argument becomes garbage, then the original statement was necessary. However, if the answer is no, if the argument still kind of works, then it wasn't necessary and you can eliminate it. So let's walk through an example. Say the choice said, the company's sales increased as a result of the new advertising campaign. Now negate it. The company's sales did not increase as a result of the new advertising campaign. Now ask, if the sales didn't increase from the ad campaign, does that wreck the argument? If the argument depends on that link, yes, it collapses. So the original claim is necessary. If the argument could still make sense without it, and it doesn't collapse, then toss it. It's not necessary. Now, of course, you want to negate carefully. Don't just throw in the word not left and right. Pay attention to what the sentence actually means. When you are negating, some becomes none, all becomes not all, is likely becomes is not likely, and tends to becomes does not tend to. Drill this because you want to learn to negate with precision. You also only want to use this tool on necessary assumption questions. The negation test does not work for sufficient assumption questions. In fact, it will actively mislead you if you try to use it there. You also only want to use this on your final contenders after you've eliminated a couple of choices. Don't waste time running this on all 5 choices. Use it to break the tie when you're down to 2 and need to make a difficult decision. And you also want to practice it now, not for the first time on test day, because the first couple times you try it, it might feel awkward or confusing, and that's totally fine. Practice it until you can negate quickly and confidently. By test day, it's going to be second nature. Now, the reason the negation test is so powerful is because necessary assumption answers are often subtle. They don't shout, they whisper. And when you're under time pressure, it's easy to overlook them. So the negation test gives you a clear, reliable way to test your intuition and confirm whether your gut feeling is actually supported by logic. This is how high scorers stay confident on trickier questions. They're not guessing, they're testing. And now you can too. So let's take everything we've talked about so far and turn it into a practical system you can use today. Because knowing the theory behind necessary and sufficient assumptions is great, but what moves your score is not knowledge, it's execution. The goal here isn't just to understand the difference between the two types, it's to make identifying them and solving them automatic, so fast and so second nature that you don't have to think about it under pressure. So here's how to do that in a short, focused daily drill. Your first step is to pull 10 assumption questions. Start with a mix, 5 necessary and 5 sufficient. You can use any prep test between 101 and 130. Stick to official prep test questions only, and don't look at the answers yet. Then you want to ID the question type before you read the stimulus, aka the argument. Do not read the argument yet. Just read the question stem and write either N for necessary or S for sufficient next to it. Your goal here is to train your brain to spot the keywords instantly, the way a high scorer would. This will eventually save you time and prevent misreads on test day. Then you want to confirm your label. Confirm the question type. If you mislabeled it, stop, go back, and reread the question stem. Ask yourself, what word threw you off? Or what clue did you miss? You're training here pattern recognition. The faster and more accurate this gets, the easier the whole section becomes. Now, you want to solve the questions one type at a time. You want to group together all the necessary questions and knock those out first, using the negation test on your top 2 or 3 choices to verify necessity. Then, switch over to sufficient assumption questions. Ask yourself, if this were 100% true, would it guarantee the conclusion? If yes, that's your answer. If not, you want to keep looking. And if the stimulus includes lots of conditionals and you're stuck, consider making a quick diagram, but only if things are getting really tangled. Next, you want to track your time and your accuracy, and this matters more than you might think. You want to write down how many you got right in each category, which question stems you mislabeled, and how much time each question took you. Most students are either fast but inaccurate or accurate but painfully slow. Your goal is both. Ideally, under 90 seconds per question with 80-90% accuracy on average. Of course, some questions are harder and take longer, and that's okay, but make sure that you're improving week by week. Then finally, you want to build your wrong answer journal, and this is where the real learning happens. For every question you got wrong, write down the full question stem, write why you labeled it incorrectly if you did, write why the right answer was either necessary or sufficient, depending on the type, and what made the wrong answer tempting. Then you want to review this every couple of days. You will start to notice patterns in your own thinking, and once you see the pattern, you can fix it. This routine takes 30 minutes a day. That's it. If you run this drill every day for a week, you're gonna feel a shift. You will start noticing assumption traps before you even finish reading the answer choices. This is not only about logic, it's about repetition. Reps build confidence. Confidence builds speed, and speed builds points. And that's how you make your prep efficient, focused, and you raise your score with time. By now, you've studied the theory, you've drilled the question stems, and you've practiced identifying necessary versus sufficient. But let me ask you this. When it really counts, when the pressure's on, can you perform? That's what it's all about, right? Because understanding the difference between necessary and sufficient isn't enough. You've got to test yourself under real LSAT conditions